The skies above Earth were no longer blue with clouds or streaked with the trails of human aircraft, but instead they were filled with the vast silhouettes of alien warships that hung like shadows of death in orbit, and every person who looked up knew that humanity was no longer free because the blockade had closed the planet off from the galaxy and cut every possible road to survival. Nations that once fought each other had united in fear and desperation, but even together they had no weapons powerful enough to strike those giant vessels which could shatter mountains and boil seas with their cannons. The people whispered in the streets about surrender, but no leader dared speak the word because surrender would mean slavery and extinction under alien rule. Families huddled in darkened rooms with ration packs, growing thinner each day while governments broadcast voices of courage they themselves barely believed. The blockade was perfect and merciless, and the aliens did not even bother firing because they wanted Earth to starve and break on its own. They only watched with cold eyes from above, as if humans were already finished. Yet despite the silence of the skies, there was noise upon the ground. Resistance fighters moved through hidden tunnels and abandoned subway lines, and in ruined warehouses, soldiers trained with rifles that seemed like toys against the armored colossi above. Children were told stories of human victories in history, and were told to hold on because the spirit of Earth could never be crushed. And somewhere inside this vast despair there was one human who refused to accept the end as written. His name was not shouted yet in streets or carved in records, but his decision would carve itself into the galaxy like thunder. He was neither a general nor a scientist nor a politician, but an ordinary man whose family had been taken by hunger and blockade. He had nothing left to lose, which made him dangerous beyond measure, because desperation can turn a man into something unstoppable. In hidden corners of the ruined city, this man listened to the broadcasts of the aliens. Their voices dripped with mockery as they declared Earth a dead world waiting to be harvested. They laughed at human weakness and marveled that a species that dared reach for the stars could be so fragile without food and fuel. He clenched his fists until blood ran from his palms because he knew they were wrong. He knew humans were dangerous precisely because they were fragile, and because they had survived on a world of storms and predators long before aliens ever learned to sail the stars. Earth was a death world, and its children carried that truth in their bones. He remembered the old saying his father told him when he was young, that when you knock on the door of fate, you must be ready for whatever answers, and with that memory burning, he decided that someone had to knock on the door of those ships that watched like vultures. The blockade command ship was larger than any city and floated with arrogance above the ruins. Its shields were said to be impossible to breach, and its cannons could vaporize any fleet within seconds. But the man had studied its patterns. He watched the way the alien vessels moved, and he noticed something no general had seen because they were too blinded by despair. He saw a rhythm in their patrols, a moment where one ship moved aside and another had yet to cover the gap. It was small, but it was real, and to him it was an open door. So he began to build, not with steel forged in factories, but with scraps pulled from fallen satellites, with wires scavenged from dead grids, with fuel stolen from hidden depots. He worked alone for months while others whispered that resistance was futile. He did not argue, he only worked because he believed that one knock could echo louder than 1,000 speeches. While leaders debated in war rooms and generals whispered of surrender, this man finished his craft and painted the old human symbol of defiance across its side. He was not a pilot trained in academies, but he strapped himself into the seat and lifted from the broken earth. People on the ground saw the small vessel rise like a spark against the endless night, and they cheered because even a spark is bright when darkness is absolute. The alien fleet noticed too, and alarms lit their decks. To them it was laughable. A single human craft charging a blockade, but the man smiled as he soared higher because he knew they did not understand the meaning of what he was about to do. He angled his ship toward the flagship that had watched over Earth like a judge and jury, and he prepared to strike not with silence but with a knock that the galaxy would never forget. The small craft rose higher and higher, cutting through the clouds until the black void of space spread wide before the man. And as the blue faded behind him, he felt the weight of Earth pressing on his back, as if every soul on the planet was riding with him. The alien fleet loomed above like a wall of steel stretching across the horizon, each warship bristling with weapons and glowing engines that pulsed with otherworldly energy. His tiny vessel shook under the pull of gravity, and the strain of engines built from scraps, yet it held because he had built it with hands that refused to tremble. Alarms rang through the alien fleet as they noticed his presence, and mocking laughter echoed across their communication channels. To them, this was nothing more than another act of human desperation, and they prepared to swat him from the sky like an insect, but still he pushed forward. Inside the command ship, the alien commander stood tall with eyes that glowed faint blue and skin marked with ridges of bone that spoke of his warrior caste. He had studied humans from a distance and dismissed them as frail creatures who survived only by chance on a dangerous world. To him, the blockade was not war, but containment, because why waste effort destroying a species that would wither on its own? When his officers reported the approach of a single human craft, he did not even bother to rise from his throne of steel. He only ordered them to broadcast the event across all channels so the humans below could watch the futility of resistance and despair further. The commander believed fear was stronger than any bombardment, and he wanted the human to serve as an example. But the man inside the small craft was no example of despair. He was steady, breathing slowly while his hands rested on the controls, and his eyes locked on the massive shadow of the command ship ahead. He thought of his father's words about knocking on fate, and he knew that this was the moment. The aliens expected surrender or silence, but he would give them something else entirely. As the flagship loomed larger until it filled his vision, he triggered his ship's improvised transmitters and sent a single sharp signal across the blockade channels. The noise was not coded in alien tongue nor in human languages of Earth, but it was a simple, repeated thundering pulse that every ear could understand. It was a knock, and it echoed through the systems of the alien fleet like a heartbeat. The commander frowned as his screens lit with the strange sound. His officers tried to jam the signal, but it cut through like a hammer against glass, and for the first time a ripple of unease passed across the bridge. The human ship did not fire weapons, it only advanced and kept knocking. Each pulse rattled the sensors of the warships and caused systems to glitch as though the very act of defiance was bending the perfect order of their blockade. The commander barked orders to destroy the vessel, and lances of plasma shot through the void, but the man weaved between them with impossible reflexes. His craft moved like a hawk diving through storms because he had grown up on Earth, where danger was constant and survival demanded courage. On the surface of Earth, billions listened as the knock was rebroadcast by the alien arrogance itself. At first they did not understand, but soon the sound became a rhythm of hope beating into their hearts. Families lifted their heads from darkened shelters, and soldiers looked at each other with fire in their eyes. A single human was facing the armada, and he was not begging for mercy. He was knocking as if to say, "Open the door or face what waits inside." The people began to whisper his act as legend, even as it happened, calling him the one who dared to knock on the stars. The alien commander snarled now because mockery had turned to irritation and irritation had turned to fear. He ordered a full barrage and the void lit with fire, but the human ship refused to fall. Each near miss only carried him closer, and the knock grew louder as if the galaxy itself was beginning to hear. The commander could not admit it to his crew, but he felt the stir of something ancient and dangerous in that sound, because it was not the noise of machines but of will. It was the sound of a species that refused chains. And as the man closed in upon the flagship with nothing but courage in his chest, he smiled grimly because he knew that this knock would echo long after he was gone. The human ship drifted closer to the alien flagship, and every screen in the command deck tracked its path as if a single insect had dared to fly toward a predator. Yet the insect did not fall, and that truth gnawed at the alien commander. He barked for the guns to fire again, but the gunners already reported that the sensors flickered, and the targeting systems were struggling, because each knock from the human vessel carried a pulse that scrambled delicate circuits. It was not a weapon of destruction, but of disruption. And the aliens who believed their technology untouchable now watched as their machines faltered in the face of something that should have been impossible. The commander's voice deepened with anger as he rose from his throne and stepped forward to the wide screen that showed the small craft still coming toward them. He wanted to see this human with his own eyes. Inside the human ship, the man felt the trembling of his hull as blasts shook space around him, yet he pressed forward. He knew his little craft could not withstand direct hits for long, but he also knew that speed and instinct were stronger than any computer, and he trusted his hands. The knock continued because he kept the transmitter alive, and his ship's systems hummed in rhythm with the beat. It was not merely sound, but a pattern designed to unsettle the enemy. He had built it after months of studying fragments of alien broadcasts and testing frequencies against their old satellites. Now it sang like a drum in the void. He smiled grimly as he saw the flagship flicker with brief blackouts of light across its surface. The great beast was blinking. Across Earth, the people watched in awe. The knock reached radios, and hidden speakers carried it through the ruins of cities. Farmers in the countryside listened with tears in their eyes because for the first time since the blockade began, they felt something stronger than despair. Soldiers in bunkers clenched their rifles and whispered that if one man could do this, then millions could rise. Hope spread like fire through dry grass, and for the aliens, this was the second shock because they had planned to choke humanity with fear, yet fear was slipping away. The knock was rewriting the spirit of Earth. On the command deck of the flagship, younger officers whispered uneasily. They had studied human biology and dismissed it as fragile, yet here was a single fragile creature forcing their mighty fleet to stumble. The commander snarled at them and ordered silence, but he too felt the pressure of the knock in his chest. It was not the sound of machines, but of will, and he recognized something dangerous. Will was harder to destroy than stone, and it was beginning to spread like a sickness through his crew. He slammed his clawed hand against the railing and demanded that the human be captured alive. If the man was destroyed, then humanity would make him a martyr, but if he was taken, then his spirit could be broken. The order was given, and smaller alien interceptors launched to surround the tiny ship. The man saw them coming, sleek black hunters armed with plasma cannons and nets of energy designed to entrap. His craft shuddered as he pushed the engines harder than they were ever meant to run. Sweat rolled down his face, but he did not falter because he remembered the faces of his lost family, and he carried their memory as armor. The interceptors moved in graceful arcs, expecting him to panic, but he guided his vessel like a hawk weaving through storms. He dipped low, skimmed the edges of their formation, and released another thunderous knock that burst across their sensors. Two of the interceptors spun out of formation, colliding as their systems glitched. The rest hesitated a moment too long, and the man cut straight through the gap, heading directly for the flagship's outer hull. When the commander saw this, he felt the second shock strike like ice in his veins. This was not random defiance, but calculated courage. The human had not come to flee or to beg for mercy. He had come to knock on the very door of the Empire itself, and the Empire was trembling. The crew scrambled to raise the shields, but the knock had weakened the fields, and they shimmered weakly like broken glass. The human ship pressed closer until the massive steel skin of the flagship filled his view, and with steady hands he released one final thunderclap across the channel so loud that it shook every warship in orbit. The galaxy had thought humans were fragile, weak, and helpless, but in that moment the alien commander understood a terrible truth. Fragile creatures who refuse to break are more dangerous than any fleet. He clenched his teeth as the human ship touched the shield and slipped through the failing barrier. The man had knocked and the door had opened, and now he was inside. The human ship slid through the weakening shield of the alien flagship, and for a moment there was silence across the command deck, as if none of the crew could believe what their eyes told them. The shield was supposed to be unbreakable, and yet this small craft patched together from scraps had pierced it like paper. Panic rippled through the officers as alarms shrieked across every console. The commander barked orders to seal the docking bays and activate the interior defenses, but the human was already moving fast. His ship clamped onto the hull, and the man leapt from his seat, pulling the battered helmet over his head as he prepared to step into the heart of the enemy. The airlock of his vessel hissed open, and he crawled into the maintenance shaft of the alien ship. The corridors were vast and glowing with strange light, yet he did not hesitate. In his hands he carried no plasma cannon nor advanced device, but something far simpler. He carried an old human tool shaped into a weapon by his own hands and powered with the raw will of Earth. As he moved deeper into the belly of the beast, he remembered every night he had spent building and testing. He had discovered by accident that alien systems were vulnerable to certain pulses and frequencies. They had designed their machines for efficiency, but never for resilience against crude interference. Humanity had lived for centuries surrounded by static storms, earthquakes, and unpredictable failures, so their engineers had grown skilled at improvisation. That was the secret weapon. Not a bomb nor a super laser, but the ability to turn scraps into hammers that could shatter perfection. He placed a small device against a wall panel and triggered it. A loud thrum shook the corridor as alien lights flickered and doors sealed, shut at random. The system was choking under the interference. He smiled grimly because this was not about killing with force but about breaking order. Humanity had always thrived in chaos, and now he was bringing chaos into the most disciplined war machine in the galaxy. Security drones rushed toward him, with glowing eyes and blades spinning, but he was faster. He rolled into cover, triggered another device, and the drones spasmed before collapsing in smoking heaps. The corridors of the flagship filled with confused shouts as alien soldiers scrambled to understand what was happening. On Earth, the people still listened to the knock, and then the broadcast filled with static and broken alien voices. They did not know exactly what was happening, but they felt it in their bones. The man who had knocked was now inside, and the impossible was unfolding. Hope flared brighter. Resistance fighters rose from tunnels and bunkers, whispering that this was the moment to prepare. The blockade might crack, and when it did, humanity would be ready to pour through. Inside the command deck, the alien commander slammed his fist on the console as more systems failed. Engines faltered, shields blinked, and communications sputtered. He demanded to know how a single human could cause such damage, but his officers had no answer. Their empire had never faced a foe that embraced weakness and turned it into strength. The commander realized with horror that they had underestimated not just this man but all of humanity. For every human who starved on the ground, another would rise in fury. For every ship they destroyed, another would be built in secret from pieces the Empire had discarded. The human race itself was the secret weapon because it could adapt to anything. The man pushed deeper into the flagship until he reached the reactor core. It pulsed with alien energy that kept the blockade alive. He stared at it with steady eyes and placed his final device against the control panel. It was not meant to destroy but to destabilize. If the core faltered even for a moment, the entire fleet would stumble. He pressed the trigger and the pulse surged. The reactor hummed violently as alarms screamed louder than before. Across orbit, alien warships flickered and drifted out of formation. The blockade was no longer unbreakable. The man whispered to himself that this was for his family, for Earth, and for every child who had been told to accept silence. He knew he might not leave alive, but that did not matter. His knock had opened. The door in his secret weapon had planted the seed of collapse. Now it was up to the people of Earth to rise through that opening. The reactor core of the alien flagship pulsed wildly as the human's device sent waves of disruption through its systems, and for the first time since the blockade had begun, the mighty fleet above Earth faltered. Warships that once held their positions with perfect precision now drifted apart as engines sputtered and shields flickered. On the ground, billions of eyes looked to the sky and saw the cracks forming in the wall that had trapped them. Children pointed at the heavens with voices full of hope, while soldiers who had hidden in bunkers began to emerge from shadows with fire in their hearts. The blockade was breaking, and the spirit of Earth was rising. The alien commander felt rage burning inside him as alarms blared across the deck. He barked for his engineers to stabilize the core and his soldiers to find the intruder, but even as his warriors spread through the corridors, the chaos only grew worse. Doors locked without. Command! Drones fell silent mid-patrol, and communication between ships became a storm of static. The commander realized the human had not brought a weapon of destruction, but something far more dangerous. A weapon of disorder that struck at the very discipline upon which his fleet depended. He had never faced such defiance before, and he felt a cold shiver of unease run along his ridged spine. The man who had dared to knock now moved swiftly through the flagship, knowing that every second he survived gave Earth another breath of hope. He slipped through shadows, avoiding patrols while his devices pulsed against the walls. He was only one man, but his actions thundered across an entire planet. For the first time, he believed he was not fighting alone, because the voices of Earth seemed to whisper in his ear, urging him forward. On Earth, leaders who had sat in silence and despair now felt courage flow back into their veins. Generals who had once whispered of surrender now shouted to their soldiers that the time to rise had come. Resistance fighters in every ruined city began to move with renewed purpose. They dragged hidden weapons from caches, they set up comm relays, and they prepared to strike back. Across mountains and oceans, the sound of the knock still echoed, carried through radios and old speakers. It became more than a signal, it became a call to arms. The alien fleet tried to tighten its grip, but the fracture was already spreading. Smaller human vessels that had been hidden in asteroid belts or buried in bunkers now lifted into the skies. They were crude compared to the alien giants, but they carried determination stronger than steel. Pilots who had trained in secret finally soared with cries of defiance as they launched missiles and energy bursts at the disoriented warships. Each strike was small, but together they became a storm. The blockade that had seemed eternal now trembled like glass under hammer blows. Inside the flagship, the commander felt fury boil over. He ordered his guards to capture the human alive at any cost, but even as he gave the command, more reports of failures came. Shield generators collapsed one by one, and engines failed to respond. His officers shifted nervously, some whispering that they had underestimated the humans. The commander silenced them with a glare, but he knew deep within his heart that the tide had turned. The man finally reached the central command corridors where alien guards clashed with him in narrow passages. He fought with nothing but his will, and the improvised weapon strapped to his arms. He was struck, he bled, but he did not stop because he knew the eyes of Earth were upon him. Every blow he landed was echoed by millions rising on the planet below. Every guard he defeated meant one more second of hope for his people. In the skies above Earth, human resistance ships began to break through the lines. Alien vessels collided in confusion, while others drifted powerless. Flames burned in the void, as the blockade that had once seemed unbreakable now fractured beyond repair. The turning tide was real and unstoppable. Humanity had refused to kneel, and now the galaxy would witness the cost of underestimating Earth. The skies above Earth were no longer silent, but alive with fire and thunder, as the alien armada struggled to hold its formation, while human ships poured upward from hidden shelters and resistance bases. For months, the aliens had believed that Earth was contained and broken, yet now their warships drifted like wounded beasts colliding with each other, as their systems faltered under the disruption planted by a single human who had dared to knock. The commander of the flagship shouted orders that echoed across the bridge, but even his authority could not hold back the tide. Crew members ran from station to station trying to stabilize engines and shields, but the pulse of interference still hummed through the hull. It was as if the heartbeat of the planet itself was striking against their metal walls. On Earth, the people looked skyward with tears streaming down their faces as they saw alien ships falter and human ships strike back. In the streets, men and women cheered while resistance fighters surged forward to reclaim strongholds that had been abandoned in despair. The knock had given them courage, and now courage gave them strength. Soldiers who had hidden in shadows poured into the open carrying rifles and rockets, knowing they could finally fight with more than desperation. They knew they were no longer alone because the alien blockade was breaking and the galaxy was watching. Inside the flagship, the human forced his way toward the command deck. His body was battered and bruised from clashes with alien guards, but his eyes still burned with fire. Every corridor was filled with smoke and sparks as systems collapsed around him. Drones lay shattered in heaps while lights flickered like dying stars. He pressed forward because he knew that the core of the blockade was not just the fleet, but the will of its commander, and if that will was broken, the entire armada would crumble. The alien commander paced the deck with fury building in his chest. Never in his long career had he seen such defiance from a conquered species. He had fought wars against empires that spanned hundreds of worlds, yet none had resisted with such raw determination. He had believed Earth to be fragile, but he now saw that fragility hid something sharper than any blade. The humans were like glass that cut deep when shattered. He refused to show fear before his crew, but in his heart he knew the battle was slipping away. Human ships swarmed in small groups striking at vulnerable targets. They darted between massive alien vessels like wolves against elephants. Every explosion lit the sky above Earth with blazing fire. Alien ships tried to respond with plasma cannons, but their accuracy faltered as interference scrambled their sensors. One by one they fell, burning into the atmosphere or drifting powerless into the void. The blockade was collapsing before the eyes of both invaders and defenders. At last, the human burst through the final doors of the command deck. Alarms screamed, sparks fell from the ceiling, and alien officers turned with weapons raised. He moved like a storm, throwing his final devices into control panels. The consoles exploded with static as the ship groaned in protest. The commander rose from his throne, tall and fierce, his ridged face twisted with anger. He shouted in his own language, demanding that the human surrender, but the man only shook his head. He spoke in a steady voice that carried across the deck even though the aliens did not understand the words. It was not about translation, but about the unbroken will in his tone. It was the sound of defiance. The commander lunged forward with a weapon drawn, but the human met him head-on. The clash was fierce and desperate. Two figures locked in struggle at the heart of the galaxy's most feared warship. Sparks showered around them as the ship itself shook under the weight of battle outside. The crew tried to intervene, but the collapsing systems forced them to their stations. The fight raged until the human drove the commander back against the railing. With one final surge, he threw the alien leader to the ground and the bridge fell silent. The flagship shuddered as if the ship itself felt the loss of its master. Across the Armada, alien crews saw their command signals vanish. Confusion turned to panic as ships broke formation. Human resistance fighters pressed the attack with newfound fury. One by one, the great warships fell until the blockade was no more. Earth was free. The fall of the Armada had come not from weapons of mass destruction, but from the courage of one human who had knocked and refused to stop. The flagship trembled in silence after the clash on its command deck, and though the alien commander lay defeated, the ship still groaned with the weight of collapsing systems. The human stood tall, breathing hard, his armor scorched and his body battered, yet his eyes burned brighter than ever. He looked out through the cracked windows of the bridge and saw the sky alive with fire where alien warships fell one by one, and human vessels pressed their attacks with the fury of a people who had been chained for too long. For the first time in months, the stars above Earth no longer looked like prison bars, but like open doors waiting to be crossed. The news spread across every continent in moments, carried by old radios and broken screens that flickered back to life. Families who had hidden in fear poured out into the streets and cheered as they saw alien ships falling in flames. Soldiers who had lost hope shouted victory as they reclaimed their cities. The blockade that had once seemed eternal was gone, and in its place was the rising spirit of Earth. People embraced one another with tears streaming down their faces because they knew they had not only survived, but had triumphed. The knock that had begun as a single sound from one man had grown into the heartbeat of an entire planet. The surviving alien ships scattered into the void, retreating in disarray. Their officers tried to rally, but the loss of the flagship and the collapse of command had shattered their will. They fled across the stars, carrying with them the memory of what had happened above Earth. They would tell their empires of the human who had broken the blockade, and of the fragile race that had turned fragility into a weapon. Fear would spread across their worlds because they had seen the truth. Humans could not be contained, and their courage could not be starved. On the flagship, the humans stood in silence as the surviving alien crew surrendered. They dropped their weapons and bowed their heads because they understood that they had been defeated not only in battle but in spirit. He left the bridge slowly, his body aching but his steps steady. He knew his mission was done. He had knocked and the galaxy had answered. His small ship was battered, but it still clung to the hull of the flagship. He climbed inside once more and guided it away from the wreckage. As he descended toward Earth, the people below saw his vessel glowing like a star, and they raised their hands to the heavens. They did not know his name, but they knew his courage, and that was enough. When his ship touched down in the ruins of a city, the people rushed forward to meet him. They lifted him from the cockpit and carried him on their shoulders as their cheers echoed across the night. For months they had whispered in fear, but now their voices roared with victory. Leaders came to him with tears in their eyes. Soldiers saluted with pride, and children clung to his hands as if he were hope made flesh. Yet he did not speak of glory or power. He only said that he had knocked for all of them and that it was Earth itself that had answered. In the years that followed, the story spread beyond Earth. Traders carried it to distant colonies, refugees whispered it on hidden routes, and even alien captains repeated it with unease. Across the galaxy, the tale became legend. They said that a lone human had knocked on the door of the most powerful fleet and the door had fallen. They said that the knock was not just a sound, but a warning that humanity would never bow. Children across Earth grew up telling the story, at night repeating the rhythm of that knock on tables and walls until it became the pulse of a new age. The human who had begun it all did not claim a throne or title. He returned to the people, lived among them, and walked the streets like anyone else. But wherever he went, the people followed him with respect in their eyes because they knew he had changed the fate of their world. And though he carried scars that would never heal, he also carried peace because he knew that his family and his planet were safe. The stars above Earth were no longer silent prisons but open paths. Humanity rebuilt its fleets not to hide but to explore and defend. The galaxy now looked upon Earth with wary respect because the knock still echoed in their memory. It was the sound of courage that shook empires and the sound of hope that gave birth to legends. And so the tale ended with a simple truth that no one would forget. A single knock had opened the door, and through that door, humanity stepped into destiny. The battlefield above Earth was silent at last, except for the drifting wreckage of alien ships that burned as they fell into the atmosphere like shattered stars. The blockade that once strangled the planet was gone, and in its place stood the spirit of a people who had refused to kneel. The lone human who had dared to rise into the sky sat inside his battered craft, watching the horizon glow with fire and dawn. His body ached with wounds and exhaustion, but his heart was steady because he knew that the sacrifice had not been for nothing. On the ground, people flooded into the streets to greet the morning as if it were the first day of freedom in history. They raised their hands toward the heavens where alien giants had once lingered, and now only wreckage remained. Families embraced as tears of relief and joy flowed freely. Soldiers saluted the rising sun with renewed pride. They knew their world was scarred but no longer broken. The blockade was gone and their courage had carried them through the storm. The aliens who fled spread the tale across their empire and beyond. They spoke in hushed voices of the human who had boarded a flagship alone and turned an armada into ruins. Fear mixed with respect as rulers of distant worlds listened. They had thought Earth a fragile stone unworthy of conquest, yet now they knew that stone could shatter blades. The sound of the knock echoed across the galaxy, carried not by machines but by whispers and memory. It became a warning to all who sought to chain humanity. The man returned to Earth quietly, though crowds awaited him as a hero. He did not seek crowns or thrones. He walked among his people with calm eyes and steady steps. Children ran to him and touched his hands as if touching history. Elders bowed their heads in gratitude. Leaders stood aside because they knew true power was not in their palaces, but in the courage that lived in one man's heart. He told them he had knocked not for himself, but for every soul on Earth. Years passed, and Earth rebuilt stronger than before. Cities rose from ruins and new fleets launched into the void not as prisoners but as explorers and defenders. The knock became legend repeated by children who tapped their fists against tables and walls to remember the sound that had carried them to freedom. It was more than a story. It was the rhythm of defiance, the heartbeat of a world that would never bend. The galaxy listened still. Empires that once mocked humanity now watched with caution, because they remembered how a single knock had brought down an armada. They whispered that humans were dangerous not because of their weapons, but because of their will. They said that, when a human knocks, the stars themselves answer. And so the tale closed not with silence but with certainty. Earth was free, humanity had risen, and one knock had echoed forever. The end.